7.
We're sneaking up on the end.
Yeah. Have you hit record yet?
Yep.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Oh.
All right. So, Matthew chapter 27. We begin here with the handover of Jesus to Pilate. Go back to 26 verses. The end of the story we were at last week, 65 through 68. Right. Where you had the high priests and the religious leaders beating up Jesus at this point in time. And we skipped over the whole Peter denial thing because we had done that previously, and so that's why we end up in chapter 27. So look at 27 verse 1. It says, when morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. So there's kind of 3 phases to this activity. We saw the first phase, which was the quote trial in the middle of the night, right, that we studied last week. Then they kind of beat him up and spit on him and scourged him and everything else. And then it gets in chapter 27, it says when morning came, then they all come back together, whether they went away or they just kind of left the beating to somebody else. But they all come back together here in the morning, and it's early morning. It's 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. They all come back together, and it says that they plotted against Jesus to put him to death. What's really going on here is they're saying they're having a conversation amongst the religious leaders. Okay, we have found him guilty of blasphemy. How do we get him killed? Do you know what their problem is? Why don't they just kill him?
They couldn't pass the death sentence.
Well, they could pass the sentence, but they couldn't carry it out. They did not have the authority under the Roman leadership in order to kill him. And so now they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we get him killed? What do we need to do in order to get him executed? And the decision then is to bring him to Pilate, as we see in verse 2. When they bound him, they led him away and delivered him up to Pontius Pilate, the governor. What's interesting here is, right, they're not trying to decide, okay, what punishment should we give him? That question is not being asked, right? It's just, okay, how do we actually put him to death? That's what we want. That's what we wanted from the beginning. Now, why is Pilate in town? Pilate's in town. Why is Pilate in town? Pilate doesn't live there.
Because it was Passover, maybe?
Yeah, because it's a big feast day. They don't know about Passover and nothing else, but they know it's a big feast day. 1 million people coming into Jerusalem. So Pilate would come down with a host of Roman soldiers to keep the peace, right? That's his purpose there, to crowd control, if you will. Now, before we go on, I just want you to flip back for a minute, back to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, I want you to see verse 17. This is Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. Chapter 20, verse 17, it says, now Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples aside on the road and said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify, and the 3rd day he will rise again. I just am amazed by this prophecy of Jesus, right? He essentially tells the disciples everything that's going to happen, right? He's going to be brought before the chief priests and the scribes. He's going to be brought to the Gentiles. He's going to be crucified. And then the 3rd day he's going to rise again. And again, the disciples just go, right? They don't get this at all. They don't understand what in the world he's talking about here. And now we're seeing the fulfillment of that prophecy that Jesus has made back there in chapter 20. So they bring him to Pilate for this trial. And I'll say right up front, and it'll become obvious later, but they're not looking for a real trial from Pilate either, right? They're looking for a rubber stamp. They're looking for Pilate to say, oh, yeah, sure, you brought him here. I'm sure he's guilty. We'll go ahead and kill him. They run into a Pilate, however, who who actually wants to ask some questions and wants to find out what's going on. So let's go on to verse 3. Now, what's interesting here is that the story of him being brought to Pilate is interrupted by the story of Judas. And so we're going to deal with that. And then if we have time, we'll get back to the trial, which picks up back in verse 11. But they bring him to Pontius Pilate, and then we have this interruption in verse 3. It says, then Judas, his betrayer, or then Judas the betrayer, his name is changed here, right? Judas the betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. So first of all, Judas saw that he had been condemned. So Judas is hanging around, right? He gives him the kiss in the garden. He follows the crowd back down to Caiaphas's house. He sees now that he has been condemned. And my translation says he was remorseful. Do you have any other words?
He regretted.
He regretted.
Seized with remorse. I
Any
said,
other words? I'm sorry.
Mine says he changed his mind.
His mind, yeah.
Changed his mind. Interesting. So some of the translations have the word repent here. He repented. And unfortunately, that's a really bad translation. So I'm kind of glad none of you have it, because this is he did not repent in the way that others repented in the scripture. Repented towards salvation. I think that he regretted is probably the best one. He had remorse over. He felt guilty about it. He had a change of feelings more than a change of mind. He felt differently about the situation. Now, so I got to ask this question: why did he feel guilt? Why did Judas feel guilt? He did what he was planning on doing. It became very successful. Why is he feeling guilty?
Maybe he didn't really know what was going to transpire and happen. When he saw to the extent of what was happening, maybe he thought, well, something different could play out. Jesus could do something miraculous, or Jesus, I don't know. He just didn't know what his actions would fully bring. Maybe.
Well, he said in mind, he said, I have sinned, so he knows he did something wrong.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just think being around Jesus, he's heard the word. And now it's like anybody these days, Christ, but you can make a bad choice or a bad decision, and then you feel bad about it because you reflect back to what you've heard and what what is true.
And some of the commentaries say that his plan all along may have been to force Jesus's hand, right? To force him to act as the Messiah and get the troops together and fight against the Romans. So he thought he would force his hand, get the Romans up there, and then Jesus would become the real Messiah, right, and take them on and blow them away, and that doesn't happen. And so now maybe he has regret about that decision that he made. So that's another piece of thought here. I think the thing that and Debbie was stepping on it there that I like is just the realization that even though someone is evil, even though someone is Satan possessed, as we know Judas was here, he still knows that he's doing evil. He still feels guilty about doing that evil. And what's interesting is, it's this internal sense of right and wrong that we have that's placed there by God. And it's what drives us to Christ, right? Knowing that we've done wrong, knowing that we're sinners, it drives us to Christ. So that's I just want you to recognize that even the most horrible of sinners here we have in Judas recognized that he had done something wrong and felt guilt about it. I want you to turn for a minute. There's an interesting passage in 2 Corinthians. Go to 2 Corinthians chapter 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8. We have here, Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and he's kind of apologizing to them. In verse 8, 2 Corinthians 7:8, it says, "For even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I perceive that the same epistle made you sorry, though only for a while. But now I rejoice, not that you were made sorry, but that your sorry led to repentance. For you were made sorry in a godly manner, that you might suffer loss from us in nothing. For godly sorrow produces repentance, leading to salvation, not to be regretted, but the sorrow of the world produces death." And so I think it's an important distinction here that this guilt, this sorrow, this regret that Judas felt here is described here by Paul, right, as a sorrow of the world, right, that produces death, not a sorrow that produces repentance. He turned his feelings, but he didn't turn his actions. He didn't turn towards God, right? He brought these comments to the religious leaders, but he didn't bring any of these comments to God for real repentance. There's no sense of real repentance of Judas here, is what I'm really trying to get at. And sometimes the words make us think that that's what happened. He was certainly sorry. He was certainly feeling guilty, but it was more sorry that it didn't work out the way he wanted it to work out. More sorry that he got caught, perhaps, in what he was doing. Now, I got to think that this is Judas's kind of last chance to get it. He feels sorry, he feels regret, and he has a choice here of either going to the religious leaders and talking to them or asking for forgiveness, right? He feels regret, he feels that he's done something wrong, but he never thinks to go to Jesus. He never thinks to go and ask for forgiveness. And I think this is the last little glimmer that Judas had of an opportunity to say, oh man, he knows he has messed up, but he doesn't know that he should go to Christ and ask for forgiveness. I will say one more thing in John, and you can turn if you like, but in John chapter 6, let me just read the passage for you. John chapter 6, verse 64. Of course, it says, Jesus was talking to the disciples. It says, "But there are some of you who do not believe." It says, "For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that did not believe and who would betray him." So Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas did not believe. It wasn't that Judas just made a mistake. He did not believe. He never does come to Christ. He never does believe. He never does understand really who Jesus is, even though he has spent all this time with him. All right, so let's get back to where we were. So Judas' betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. So he's trying to undo what he's done. He's bringing back the pieces of silver to the chief priests and the scribes and returning them, trying to undo. He's not here seeking the Lord. He's not here seeking God. He wants relief from this guilt, not forgiveness. That's a big difference, right? He wants the guilt to go away, but he's not seeking forgiveness. We'll go down to verse 4, as someone said. He says here, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And so that's an amazing statement, really, right? I have sinned. He recognizes that what he has done is sinned. And what does he say he has sinned in doing?
Betraying innocent blood.
He betrays. So what does that mean?
Means he's accused somebody that's innocent of being guilty.
Right. I mean, I'm sorry. It's simple, right? But he has told them that he's guilty. He has brought them to him, and again, he doesn't say, I have sinned that I have, falsely accused the Messiah, that I have falsely accused God, nothing there. Again, no recognition of what he has really done. Just that he knows at least that this man is innocent of the things that are being accused of him as the crowd is shouting things against him. It reminds me, back in Exodus, you remember the story of Moses, of course, going to Pharaoh and all of the plagues that come upon him. At one point in time, after they've done the hailstones, Moses comes into Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to him, I have sinned. Right? Pharaoh recognizes that he has sinned against God, and he wants there therefore to be no more hail. Right? Listen, I'll let your people go. I have sinned. I'll let your people go. But of course, he never does. Right? He doesn't let the people go until the final plague comes upon them. And I think you got the same situation here where Judas is recognizing he's done something wrong. He says, I have sinned. He confesses that to the religious leaders. Notice he does not confess it to God. Right? You never see him breaking down, going to God, saying, I have sinned. None of that. He comes back to the religious leaders. Now, why does he come back to the religious leaders? Why does he come back to them? What's he hoping to accomplish?
Maybe he's looking for a position.
No.
Thank you.
Maybe trying to convince them that they should let him go. He made a mistake. It's not.
Yeah, so I want to remind you when we talked about the Jewish trial system, right? That they would have the first trial, they would make the condemnation, and then they would wait 3 days, right? They'd go into prayer and fasting. One of the reasons for waiting 3 days was to give an opportunity for anyone to say, hey, wait a minute, I have other testimony. I have other testimony that I need to give you that could allow this person to go free. And so this is exactly what Judas is doing here. He's coming back to them saying, hey, I was actually a false witness. I was a false witness against a man for condemnation. Now, whoa, my screen just went blank. You all still there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. If the Jews had gone by their own rules, and Judas here is coming back saying he was a false witness, I have betrayed innocent blood, what should the Jews have done?
Could have carried out the sentence against him.
Right. They should have carried out the sentence against Judas. Judas should have been killed. I think, honestly, this is exactly what Judas wanted, right? He recognized that he had messed up, that he had betrayed innocent blood. He eventually goes out and commits suicide, but he wanted them to kill him. He's coming forward as a false witness. He's wanting to get Jesus off the hook, and the easiest way to do that is for him to come in and admit that he was a false witness. They would take his life. He wouldn't have to live with this guilt. He wouldn't have to live with the pain of doing that. What am I missing?
There's weird pictures on the
Your
screen.
thumb came up.
Give me some thumbs up here.
Okay, sorry.
You're doing it.
You like what you said.
You put your hand up, it was similar to your thumb.
It was that emoji that you saw on Zoom the other night when you were
Yeah.
talking, and then it popped up.
Okay, I have no idea. I don't know what I said. So, do you have any idea what I just talked about? It was important. So he comes back to them. Now, what's amazing, right? First of all, they didn't wait 3 days, right? They waited maybe an hour or so, because it says here again at the beginning of this verse 1, right? When the morning came, so they're coming back together again. And sometime during that period, Judas comes to them and says, hey, I've got new testimony. Now, what they should have done is reconvened and listened to his testimony. But what is their response?
Your problem.
Yeah. What is that to us? You see to it. You take care. This is not our problem. You're the one who was the false witness. We didn't do anything wrong. All we did was listen to your testimony. All we did was, you guided us to the person who was this evildoer. I mean, it just shows that the religious leaders had no concern about the truth, right? They weren't interested in listening to his testimony. They weren't concerned about his guilt or innocence. They just wanted him dead. It really shows the religious leaders as criminals, really, in this trial. They're the ones who are completely disobeying the law in everything they're doing. The other thing is, it shows a complete lack of concern for Judas, right? So these are the religious leaders. These are the people who are supposed to be looking out for people's souls. And they have Judas coming to them as a false witness, broken, and all they can say is, that's not a concern of ours. That's not important to me, right? I mean, it just shows it just compiles the ugliness of these people who they're all concerned about getting Jesus killed. They're not concerned about Judas, who has just done them a big favor, and is hurting and doesn't know where to turn. And just imagine, right? If they had the compassion of Christ here, it could have turned Judas around, right? This was his opportunity to actually see it. There's no one there to direct him, because all of the false teachers, all of the religious leaders are just turning their backs on him. It just reminds me of the world today. The world is not concerned about people in their sin, right? People use other people. They have no remorse for it. Yeah. Okay, so the final thing I just want to say before we go on to verse 5 is Judas here is giving a testimony to Jesus's innocence. Don't miss that point, right? Here's the guy that condemned him. Here's the guy that brought the crowd to him, the multitude to him, right? But here, very clearly, he is testifying to the innocence of Jesus. Let's keep going then. Verse 5. It says, then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. So it says that he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple. Now, there's a lot of different thoughts on that in the commentaries. I'll just give you mine. I think they had the first trial in Caiaphas's house. Then I think when it says in the morning they all came together, I think they came back together in the temple to make the thing official, right? They had the real fake trial in the middle of the night. Then they come back in the morning to make the thing official, because again, they couldn't have a trial at night. The trials had to be on the temple grounds. And so they do that now. And so when it says here that that Judas threw down the pieces of silver in the temple, I think that's why. That's where the Sanhedrin would be then. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is the word temple that's used here is actually the word for the Holy of Holies, okay? So he takes the money. He's not allowed to go into the Holy of Holies, right? That's only for the chief priest, but he throws the money into the Holy of Holies. And what's interesting here is, right, the only ones who could pick up that money are the chief priests, right? The ones who are allowed into the Holy of Holies. So he wanted them to get that blood money on their hands. And so he throws the money in anger into the Holy of Holies to force the priest to actually get it. Now, the other thing that's interesting here to me is that this is Judas, who all his life has been worried about money. And now this money, which he has done this dastardly deed for, not only has no value to him, he hates this money. He wants to throw it away. It's amazing that, we hear stories of people that they're all worried about their money. Then all of a sudden they realize money cannot buy you what you really need, right? And I think this is Judas realizing that this money has no value to him. Yeah, he's got this guilt. He has no way to get rid of it, and this money has no value to him, and he throws it back to the chief priests. He threw down the pieces of silver in the temple, and he departed and went and hanged himself. Why did Jesus hang himself?
First thought it was he thought the guilt was probably just too much. And he realized what he had done. But like I said, he wasn't a believer, but his guilt or his conscience just couldn't allow him. And of course, he threw the money away, and it just probably just built up, says, hey, I'm out of here.
Are you talking about the reason or the method?
No, the reason. I mean, no. Why did he kill himself, regardless of whether he hanged himself?
And he didn't probably want to see what was coming.
Yeah.
All the things Tom said, plus he didn't want to face what he
Yeah.
had done and what was coming.
Yeah, he realized he had crucified the Son of God. He realized what he had done.
Well, I'm not sure he realized that much, Russell. He certainly realized that he had sentenced to death his friend. He sentenced to death this innocent person. I'm not sure he realized this was the Son of God, though. That's because if he had realized it was the Son of God,
He wouldn't have done
he
it.
had realized that this man could forgive sins, I think he would have turned to him. Right? He could have done that. Still, at this point, he could have turned to Christ and asked for forgiveness, but he doesn't. He didn't know who he was, which is amazing after spending 3 years with him.
Yep.
But yeah, I agree with everything that you said. It's the guilt. There is a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 21-23. We won't turn there, but it says, "Cursed is he that hangeth on a tree," right? He's punishing himself. He feels like he deserves death for what he's done. He feels guilty for it, and he feels like this is his just deserts, if you will, for what he has done. I guess I just, he could have made a different choice here, and this is the choice that people make day in and day out. He could have made a different choice here and turned to Christ, but didn't. There's a little commentary question here in Acts chapter 1. It also talks about the death of Judas, and it says there that he fell face forward into a field and that his bowels gushed out. And so there's some questions about, wait a minute, did he hang himself or did he just fall into this field, right? And what the best description of why that's so is people who say, well, he was pretty terrible at everything he did, and he was pretty terrible at tying the knot that he hung himself with, and the knot just broke, and then he fell and smashed his head in the fields. I don't know. To me, it's not a big concern. He died, and he killed himself. Both of them agree to that. So anyway, now let's get back to our story. Verse 6. It says, "But the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, 'It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood.'" Now, these are wonderful men, right, who are very concerned about the consecration of the temple. They have no problem spending this money to procure his blood. But now, back in Matthew chapter 23, you remember in the woe, woe, woe section, one of the things they said was they strained out a gnat to swallow a camel. This is exactly what they're doing here. They're worried about using this money for the temple. They couldn't consecrate it for temple use, but they don't mind that they use the same money in order to purchase Christ's blood from Judas. It's just the way that they could partition that in their minds, and it was okay for them to do one and not okay for them to do the other, is just amazing. Now, you notice interesting thing, however, here in what they've said. They said it's not lawful for them to put into the treasury because they are the price of blood. the chief priests and the scribes are saying this, right? It's the price of blood. They're saying this is blood money. This is money that was paid to get false witness against someone that they knew was innocent. This is an admission by the chief priests that they knew Jesus was innocent because this was blood money. This was money that was paid illegitimately to get someone killed. So this in and of itself is fascinating, right? First, you've got the testimony of Judas. This is an innocent person. And then by this statement alone, you got the testimony by the chief priests and scribes that this was an innocent person. They knew that.
Rich, how many
Good.
people do you think, any sense of how many people were kind of on that, the chief priest and the scribes and all that? Any sense of how many were kind of involved?
Yeah, the Sanhedrin was 71 people. Okay, so the chief priests, scribes, and elders, when they all got together, it was 71. It was an odd number, right, so that they could break a tie. But yeah, now, were they all there? We don't think so. Again, we talked about Joseph Arimathea later saying that he did not agree with the vote, or was not a part of the vote. So whether he was there and he voted no, we don't know. But yeah, 71 people. So this is a big crowd that were in on this. It wasn't just a small group of people that. And I would say, Tom, particularly in the morning here, it's probably the big crowd. Now it may have been a smaller crowd in the evening, just who they could wake up. But here now in the morning, my guess is it's a big crowd. All right, so now verse 7 says, and they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Again, these are just these wonderful people, right? They have, what a good deed they're doing here. They consulted together, what are we going to do with this money? We can't consecrate it. We can't use it in the temple. So they bought the potter's field. Now, by the potter's field, they mean the field that people would go out to collect clay in order to make pots, right? That was the potter's field. Now they bought it, they used this money, 30 pieces of silver, which is pretty cheap for a field. Okay, so it's very likely that the field was no good anymore. In other words, it was out of clay, and it was just a wasted piece of land. And so they bought this piece of land cheap, and they would use it for burying people that were not Jews that died in town, right? So if a Gentile come in, you can't put him in a Jewish cemetery. That would defile the cemetery. And so they bought this plot of land so that they could put the Gentiles in that might happen to die. So what a wonderful thing, how compassionate they are towards the Gentile. I mean, again, just the way that they can slice up their brains and think that they're doing something incredible here while they're using this blood money to do it is just fascinating. And then in verse 8, it says, therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Now that's, again, an interesting statement. That field is called the field of blood to this day. Who calls it the field of blood?
Jews?
They do.
Everybody does. It's the field of blood. Everybody knows that field, right? It's the field. It's known that way today. It's the general term that's used for that field. So what does that say? That says that the general population understood that that field was bought with blood money. It's the field of blood. It's the field of blood money. That's what is being said there. So again, the testimonies here are fascinating. You got the testimony of Jesus. This is an innocent man. You got the testimony of the chief priests, right? Saying that he was innocent by saying that they wouldn't use this money that was blood money. And then you got the testimony of the whole Jewish nation here, that this field of blood was paid for with blood money because the man was innocent. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called blood money. So everybody knew that Jesus was innocent. I just find that powerful. And it's just not something we think about, especially as we go into the trial and everything else, and the crucifixion and everything, that the people understood that this was an innocent man that was being killed. It was general knowledge. All right, verse 9 and 10 says, then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for potter's field as the Lord directed. So this is a prophecy, and there's one little problem with this prophecy. Anybody, you have a note at the bottom that tells you what it is? The problem is that Jeremiah didn't say it. It's actually a quote from Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13, these two verses. So anybody, is there a note or anything that tells you guys why in the world do they say it's Jeremiah when this is actually Zechariah? Or does anybody have a thought as to why that might be?
Mine says it's a combination of the two prophets, and Matthew refers to Jeremiah as the prominent prophet.
Yeah, that is not such a good one, Rick. The reason I'm saying that is, some of the commentaries say that. The problem is that in Jeremiah, where he talks about something similar, it's not even close to what is being said here. And so to say it's a mashup of Jeremiah and Zechariah is a stretch. How about that? Any other thoughts as to why he would say Zechariah when it's really Jeremiah, or the other way around? He says Jeremiah when it's really Zechariah. So there's an interesting. So let me tell you what I've found that I just think it's cool when you find these things out. You know that when we talk about the Old Testament, we talk about the law and the prophets, the law and the prophets, the law and the prophets. And at one time, they were called the books of Moses and the books of Jeremiah. The reason was that Jeremiah at one time was the first book in the book of prophets, in the prophets part, right? You also have the Psalms, right? That's a separate thing. But you have the law and the prophets. Jeremiah was the first book in the prophets. So they would often talk about, instead of the law and the prophets, they would talk about the law and Jeremiah, or they would talk about Moses and Jeremiah. They would just say Moses and Jeremiah, and they would be talking about the whole Old Testament. So here the one explanation, and Rick's could be just as good as mine, but one explanation here is that he's just using the word Jeremiah to talk about the prophets have said. And in fact, some of the old versions of the Bible, it simply says was spoken by the prophet and doesn't have the word Jeremiah in there at all. Someone has added Jeremiah in there, as the translations have gone forward. So anyway, it is a prophecy. It's in Zechariah. It's not in Jeremiah. You can deal with that however you like. Okay. The main thing I want us to get out of this whole section on Judas's death, however, is this, you got to ask the question, why is this even in here? Why do the gospel writers put, well, in fact, it's only here in Matthew, but why does Matthew put it in here? Why does he add this whole section about Judas? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I just think it's ironic that everybody knew, the Judas and the Sanhedrin, everyone knew that he was innocent, but yet they condemned him anyway.
Yeah, they hated him.
It just shows the frailty of humankind, that we just don't, without Jesus, we don't have the capacity to love.
Yeah. And go ahead.
If you're talking about some of the details with the potter's field and things, that was again to link prophecy to that time, because Matthew wrote obviously to the Jews, and
right.
So that was yet another evidence to them of prophecy fulfilled.
Okay, good. That's good.
Fulfillment of prophecy.
Fulfillment of prophecy. Yeah, I get that. I think to me, the reason is, what was Matthew's main job in the whole book? It was to show the glory of Christ, to show the majesty of who he was, all the way from his birth through where we are here. And I think he's doing the same thing here. He's allowing Judas, the chief priest, and the people to say, this guy is innocent. This guy really is God. This guy really is the Messiah. He's allowing this story here, I believe, to give these testimonies about who Christ is and the innocence of Christ. Because I think, again, Matthew's whole point is to show the majesty of Christ, and this is the way he's doing it here, even in this story that seems strange, but is really about showing the majesty of Christ, the innocence of Christ. And I, no question, to fulfill prophecy is part of that answer. So, all right. Now, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to get you started on where we're going to go next time with this trial. And so go back to verse 1 and 2 again, right? They all came in the morning, the chief priests and the elders. They decide they're going to have to take him to the Romans. And by the way, do you know anybody that the Jews actually killed by themselves without going to the Romans? Maybe Stephen. Remember, they stoned Stephen. Now, how did they get away with that? Why were they allowed to stone Stephen?
Because they accused him of blasphemy, and that was sufficient for them to carry out that's what the law was. That was sufficient for them to carry it out.
But why didn't they do that against Jesus?
I don't know.
I don't know if the people, I'd have to look at it again, if the people actually stoned Stephen, or if they just kind of riled up the people. In this case, they may not have thought they would be able to do that against Christ. I don't know.
So what they did against Stephen was completely illegal. They did not have the authority to do that. They did not have the authority to kill Stephen. They did it illegally, but the Romans didn't care. It's just some little Stephen guy. I don't care, right? But if they had tried to do that against Jesus, they were afraid of the crowds, right? They were afraid of the people. So let's get this official. Let's make sure we do this right. Let's go to the Romans. Let's get their authority. Let's make it happen that way. It's really interesting, right? That again, they're terrified of the people, and so they have to get permission in this case. But with Stephen, they just took care of it. Fascinating. Yeah.
People, they were about to stone the woman caught in adultery. I mean, did they do that illegal practice often?
Yes, they did. And again, the Romans didn't care. You're just killing Jews. What do we care? As long as you don't kill a Roman. Yeah. All right. So I'm trying to figure out what I should do and what I shouldn't do in the time we have remaining, so I don't get you totally confused. But let's look at verse 11, and let me start introducing some of the stuff here. Verse 11 says, now Jesus stood before the governor, and this is Pilate. Pilate was the governor, by the way, from AD 26 through 36. So he was right here at the right time. Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, it is as you say. Now, the question has to be asked, why did the governor ask him that question? Right? What would make him say, what would make him ask the question, are you king of the Jews? Why would he ask that? That seems like a strange question for him to ask. Had anybody said he was the king of the Jews?
Trying to find out if he's claiming that he is the king.
Yeah.
He can do something to him if he's claiming he's the king.
Was he a threat to Roman power? Because the emperor was the one that was basically the top guy. And
But wait a minute, these chief priests and scribes come to him saying, this guy is saying blasphemy, right? Because he was saying that he was deity. He didn't say that he was king.
I don't think Pilate cares about the Jewish religion. He's cared about, is this a threat to Roman rule?
Yeah.
That was it. That's like I said, why he came down during
Right.
the. And so his whole thing, control of the crowd and the Jewish people, if there was an internal thing with their religion, now that's okay, that's fine. But was this a threat to Roman rule?
So why didn't he ask questions like, are you trying to rile up the people? Are you trying to be an insurrectionist? Are you, getting a crowd together? Are you mounting a war party? He doesn't. He says, are you king? So what I want to introduce you to is that we have an incomplete story here in Matthew. And we've got to turn to the other Gospels to get the rest of the story. Particularly one of our favorite places, of course, which is John chapter 18. And then we also have to look at some passages in Luke. So we still got a couple minutes. Let's turn to John 18 to get started. This is a lot to cover here, so we covered a little bit of it today, a little bit of it, and the rest of it next time. We turn to John 18 for a piece of the story in verse 28. John 18:28. Mine says, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. So the praetorium would be the place where Pilate held court. And it was early morning, but they did themselves not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And we talked about this before when we were looking at the dates and such, that the Jerusalem Jews would have the Passover on Friday, which was still ahead of them. So they did not want to go in to a Gentile house because that would defile them. Again, it just smacks me of hypocrisy, right? Here you have these Jews who are plotting to kill Jesus, have had this illegal trial, have sentenced him to death, and they're worried about going into a Gentile house. It's like, come on, guys. Do you have any idea what's important here? Anyway, so verse 29, Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? All right, so this makes sense. They're bringing a criminal to him, and Pilate says, hey, what's the indictment? What are you charging him with, right? And then, I lost my place. Oh, and they answer verse 30. And they answered him saying, if he were not an evildoer, would we not have delivered him up to you? What arrogance, right? They, by the way, don't bring a charge here. They just say, hey, if he wasn't an evil person, we wouldn't have brought him to you. We just want your rubber stamp, Pilate. Just give us a rubber stamp. We don't want anything else. And Pilate, verse 31, Pilate said to him, you take him and judge him according to your law. And therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, right? So that is, again, why they're bringing him to Pilate. And then verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying of what death he would die. Now, do you remember this? Verse, where am I? Oh, yeah, in John, go back to chapter 12. John chapter 12. Verse 32. It says, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. Right? So again, they brought him to, bringing him to Pilate was again all part of the plan. Right? All part of God's plan, because he was to be crucified, and Jesus knew that. And so, bringing him to Pilate, it was to complete that prophecy, if you will, that Jesus spoke about his own death. Now, again, the Jews here are trying to maintain their legal appearance, but again, you notice they did not bring any accusation against him, right? They just say, hey, he's guilty. We know he's guilty, so you guys just need to kill him. We need him killed, and you guys are the only one that can do that. So again, why does Pilate say, are you king? I need you to go back now to Luke. We got to pick the whole story, yeah? In Luke chapter 23. In Luke chapter 23, verse 1, again, we have this same story. Verse 1, it says, then the whole multitude of them, this is the Sanhedrin, arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Now, where in the world did they get that from? They had a trial at night. They brought all these witnesses. They couldn't get any of them to agree. They finally got Jesus to say that he was the Messiah, and so they accused him of blasphemy. Now they bring him to Pilate, and they say, you know, he's perverting the nation, forbidding people to pay taxes, and he's saying that he is a king. Where did this come from?
They had to make a charge that would stick with Pilate. Because
Yep.
their Jewish law didn't hold any water with Romans.
Yeah, this just came out of their evil little minds. is where this came from. Exactly as Rick has said, the Romans would not kill him for blasphemy. That didn't mean anything to them. They had to come up with a charge that the Romans would be concerned about, and you know, perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, calling himself king. Those are things that could get you killed in the Roman world. And so the chief priests, they don't have a charge, they don't have a crime, so they simply make one up. And they bring that to Pilate. And this is then where we pick up the story now back in Matthew, when he says, are you king? Right? They have brought the charge against him, saying that he has said he's king. Pilate then wants an answer to that question, are you king? And Jesus in Matthew's version says, it is as you say, which, as we've seen before, means you bet your booties I am. But he gives we're going to stop here right now, but he gives a more complete version of an answer to that question in John. And so we'll look at that next time when we get together. But we're beginning this interesting interaction with Pilate. And I'll give you the punchline. The punchline is Pilate says, I don't find anything wrong with this guy. I don't see a crime. Pilate confesses his innocence, right? Herod confesses his innocence. Everyone has confessed his innocence, as Russell said, right? And still they kill him. So we'll pick up those stories next time we get together. Any other thoughts on this? I did find it interesting that we are in the final days of Jesus's life here, final hours. We're going to be covering the crucifixion here during Christmas. I don't think that's something that God didn't plan. I think he wants us to recognize this baby as something much more than a cute picture at Christmas. All right, anything else before we go to prayer time? All right, Joe is in the other room with Jackson. He's been here with us since Thursday. He'll go back home tonight. And we're tired. And then we had that really bad ball game yesterday, so I'm exhausted. Anyway, we've had a fun weekend. But we don't have any other special prayer requests at this point. So we'll turn it to you, Hugh.
Turn off the recording.
All right, thank you.